I think there's something sort of powerful and appealing about the sort of the secret life of toys idea, the idea that inanimate objects, may come to life when human beings aren't looking. I think that's always been a sort of an interesting idea and something that was intriguing, to me as a child. So that was established very well in the first movie. And then the challenge and sort of the opportunity was to take that idea, take what had been established so well in the first film, and then try and push it further, push it into a different genre, a different kind of story for this sequel. Well, we definitely wanted to make this a more complicated, emotional story for Gnomeo and Juliet. In fact, when I first met James McAvoy and Emily Blunt and introduced myself as the new director, I asked them both what they'd like to do in a second film, and they both said that they'd like to dig a bit deeper into their characters, to have them be a bit more emotionally complicated, to even be a bit flawed, and so we sort of tried to construct a story that would allow that to happen. And this if the first film was sort of girl meets boy, then I think this film is how does girl and boy stay together. It's about respect in relationships, and that's sort of really the theme of the film, and it's a theme that sort of played out in the parallel stories of the relationship of Gnomeo and Juliet and Sherlock and Dr. Watson. This is a much bigger movie in terms of its visual scope than the first film. The first film was sort of basically set in a couple of gardens and sort of a street and a park. And this film is, takes place all across London, so it's a much bigger backdrop to tell the story against. And the first film was sort of a musical romantic comedy, and this film is much more a sort of a comedy adventure. Well, when we first pitched the idea to Paramount, we pitched it as a Sherlock Holmes story, 12 inches tall. And I loved Sherlock Holmes, I loved those stories when I was a child growing up. Sherlock and Tarzan were my two favorite literary characters. So we wanted to, be respectful as much as we could of the canon and Sherlock Holmes. We didn't want to make a parody. We didn't want to be too far away from the original source. But we did want to have fun with the scale and the idea of pieces of pottery out in a very hostile environment, London. Irene Adler is an extremely powerful figure from the Sherlock Holmes canon, although she's only really in one main story and referenced in a couple of others, and yet she has a huge influence because she is the woman to Sherlock. She's the only woman that Sherlock seems to have had any great respect for, and that has been interpreted in other stories as possibly being a romance or partnership or who knows. So we have our own version of that in our film. Irene in our film is a absolutely beautiful wooden doll, hand carved. We think she's the sort of like almost an art object, a one-off, and we meet her as the sort of slightly enigmatic boss of in a doll museum full of kind of weird, creepy Victorian dolls, where she's sort of seems to be somewhat like an underworld boss, but also seems to have had some prior relationship with Sherlock that didn't seem to go too well. And Irene in our story is played by Mary J. Blige. And we have Chiwetel Ejiofor playing Watson, and we definitely didn't want a Nigel Bruce Watson from the Basil Rathbone films, sort of the slightly bumbling old duffer. We wanted, a Watson that was much more true to, Conan Doyle, even though we sort of adopted a slightly Nigel Bruce design. He's sort of quite short and portly because we figured that the gnome factory who'd made, Sherlock Gnomes and Dr. Watson would make the cliche, so they would make, Sherlock Gnomes look like the cliched version of Sherlock with the deerstalker and the Inverness cape, and that Watson would probably come out looking a bit Nigel Bruce. But he doesn't behave like Nigel Bruce. He's very sharp, almost Sherlock's equal, very athletic despite his physique, very brave and courageous. He's much he's much truer, I think, to the book in his personality and character than he appears visually. The process of developing any character begins with drawings. Just starting with sketches and based around an idea, and then the drawings often take on a life of their own, and that may lead you down a certain route, and you may abandon some of the earlier things because you see a drawing that sort of gives you some inspiration. Why was it important to take Gnomeo and Juliet out of their gardens for this movie? Well, Gnomeo and Juliet spend actually quite a lot of time separated in this film. And that's one of the things we wanted to do in the film, was to really test them, physically and psychologically. So we took them away from everything that they know. We took them away from their relationship. We took them away from their family. We took them out of their gardens, or out of any garden, which is sort of, a gnome's comfort zone, sort of soft grass and sort of, soft earth and things, and we put them in this very hostile environment of a big, urban city like London, full of dangerous hard surfaces, and they're country gnomes in the big city that don't know how the big city works. So we really wanted to make life as challenging and difficult for them as possible, so that they could both really, be tested and earn their reconciliation at the end of the movie. First film has quite a limited set of locations, which is entirely, appropriate to the story it was telling. Two gardens in conflict, the sort of the street behind those gardens and a park. Our film, as I said, is designed to be a big adventure that ranges all across London. So that means we have many more locations. Our locations are, much bigger and much more complicated. And so it was a much more challenging thing to do, to have a lot of environments and a lot of, very difficult and complicated environments. I think the role of the director is to sort of supply an overall vision for the film, and try and inspire everybody on the film, who's working on the film, with that vision, and to get everybody pointed in the same direction. And then, basically to leave them the hell alone when they know what they're doing, and to sort of step in and gently course correct if you think the film is not following, the path that it should, and to try and make as many good decisions as often as possible. In a live action film, you shoot a lot of coverage. And we can't afford to do that in an animated film. It's too expensive. So we do all our coverage basically and try and get our mistakes out the way in story, where we're just throwing away black and white sketches. But those simple black and white sketches that we create in story department can tell you whether an idea is working, or whether you should abandon it. And if it works slightly, even slightly, in a simple black and white sketch, if you can get a laugh or even an emotional reaction from looking at a series of black and white drawings, sort of projected like a filmed comic strip, that is a very useful and fairly inexpensive tool to tell you whether your film is sort of on the right track or not, before you go into the very complicated and expensive process of actually, moving it into three-dimensional computer graphics. I'm incredibly blessed and lucky because we have an amazing cast for this film. All the cast from the first movie, Emily Blunt, James McAvoy, Michael Caine, Maggie Smith, Stephen Merchant, Matt Lucas, Ashley Jensen, Ozzy Osbourne. They're all returning for this film. Plus we've added Johnny Depp as Sherlock, and Chiwetel Ejiofor as Dr. Watson. Mary J. Blige is Irene Adler, and Jamie Demetriou is our villain Moriarty. And they're all absolutely extraordinary, and they make my life very easy, because when you work with people who are that talented, it's just a gift. It's important to remember that our main character is Sherlock Gnomes. It's not Sherlock Holmes. He's a pottery interpretation of Sherlock Holmes. So he's allowed to be a little, we take a few more liberties with Sherlock than if we were doing a canonical Sherlock Holmes story. At the heart, we wanted to be as true to Conan Doyle's Sherlock as we could be. That Sherlock always fights on the side of the angels, that even though he might be annoying and eccentric and sometimes appear to be lacking in empathy, or focused on his work above all things, when push comes to shove, Sherlock will put himself in harm's way to so that good will prevail. And that was sort of a key thing when I was talking to Johnny, that we would have in Sherlock, that however eccentric and however funny, Sherlock, might be on occasion, at his heart, he is a protector and a noble character that will, sort of risk everything to make sure that, that good wins and evil is defeated. One of the first things that I sort of challenged myself with and challenged the crew with was like, what if this film was being shot by a 12-inch Gnome camera crew, and we just equipped them with like scaled camera equipment, anything they like. They got great cameras, and they've got great sort of rigs and cranes and booms and everything, but it's all scaled. How would what would those camera moves be like? How would that look? If our characters who are small were close to camera, then what happens to the world behind? And so, depth of field became a sort of an important storytelling tool for us. All movie making is a collaboration, and making an animated movie is probably the highest degree of collaboration possible, because every single thing that you see has to be designed. Nothing is free. So you have to work with many very talented people to get anything up on the screen, and that's the fun, and a lot of it is very hard work that goes on for a long time. You spend years and years of your life making one of these things, but the highlight is always if you've worked with a crew of people that you really like and admire. Music is, it's a very big and important part of the film, as it was in the first film. It's a very key element, because we have Elton John and Bernie Taupin from who are sort of writing new songs as they did for the first film. Also, we're reusing sort of classic Elton John songs, but we're sort of reimagining them in a new way. We're having Panau sort of remix classic Elton, and then we're taking sort of musical motifs from Elton John's work, and we're interleaving that in the actual score for the film. So there'll be phrases from Elton John songs that will appear in the orchestral score.